All right, so I'll kind of cover, so I see a lot of familiar faces, but my name's Lucas Haag. Was area agronomist for this area for about 13 years, and then we just did a reshuffle here this summer. So Jeannie Falk Jones is now the area agronomist that covers this territory, 29 counties, and then I'm now I've been doing it on an interim basis for about 4 years, but I'm now the permanent agronomist in charge at the Tribune Station. So kind of had a little bit of a shuffle in duties. So, but anyways, I've been involved in I'm not a soil fertility guy by training, but that's where a lot of our work is gravitated to in recent years, just because that's where the greatest need has been. My original interest, what originally got me into agronomy and going to grad school, was precision ag work, and so the nutrient management stuff certainly plays a role in that. So what I'm going to cover, I've got just kind of a few things on phosphorus. Some of it I'm sure is stuff you've seen before, some of it's hopefully new, but I'm going to try and tie that together in terms of things that I think we should consider as we're trying to make budgets work. Got just a few things there at the end of this on top dress and wheat, and then we'll kind of shift into more of a nitrogen discussion. And at the end, I've got a few teasers out of Peter shown some of it. I got a few other teasers out of some of the nitrogen trials we've been conducting across the state. So you guys know I like to keep it pretty informal. If you got question, comment, whatever, I think it's always easier to just handle it while we're on that than to try and remember it for later. So. Okay, so what's some opportunities, cutting fertilizer rates, and that's always, I haven't heard as many of these calls this year, but a couple of years ago when we were looking at, dollar a pound nitrogen and 80-some cent in, I got a lot of calls, and it was just people, well, we're just going to cut X% across the board. It's like, well, let's visit and let's see if we can be a little bit more strategic about how we might want to do that. A lot we're going to talk about, is of course efficiency. How can we raise the same yield on less pounds? But anyway, we're going to start on the phosphorus side of this. And some of what Peter discussed has kind of already introduced some of the concepts. Again, this idea of this critical value. Historically, we've considered that to be around 20 part per million on a Mehlich 3 scale, regardless of crop. I'll touch on that here again in a minute. But one of the things, and this is a data set that maybe Dorovar, Riaz Diaz at K-State, Antonio Malerno at Iowa State, they've pooled both Kansas and Iowa data together to see if we can get some better or different insights from the literally hundreds of soil fertility trials that have been conducted. So this is across Kansas and Iowa, 460 site years in here. And this overall, for corn, this again gets back to, historically we've treated 20 part per million as being the number across crops. Now I think we've known for a long time that crops respond differently to phosphorus. If you had to think about the common crops that we raise, what comes to your mind as being the most responsive crop to phos of the ones we typically grow out here? Wheat. Wheat tends to be our most responsive. I'll show some other slides later, but actually our more recent data is showing that critical value for wheat is actually higher than 20 part per million. Our critical value for corn typically comes in a little bit under 20 part per million. And that's one of the things, we'll talk about our nitrogen recommendations here in a bit. We've been in the process of overhauling K-State's recommendations. We did a major overhaul 2 years ago on corn, sorghum, and wheat nitrogen. Next in the rotation is going to be phosphorus. And this is one of the things we're going to have to wrestle with internally is what do we do with this in our recommendations? Because in terms of what your critical value is, really there's now questions that kind of preface that. It's like, well, do you have wheat in your rotation? Because if you have wheat in your rotation, that's going to require a higher critical value than, say, if you're just in corn beans or continuous corn. And so it kind of, that's the downside of having more data, is it becomes a little more complicated because there's a lot more of the it depends. And that actually becomes almost more of an economics question than an agronomic question. So anyways, this is the pooled data for Kansas, Iowa, again showing that critical test about 18 part per million. Peter had mentioned earlier, what does that critical value actually mean? And basically, it's not an absolute, it's a probability thing. It's like, okay, once, and really all along, if we think about the range of soil test p-values and how we translate that back into a recommendation, part of what's at play there is what's the probability of seeing a response, okay? And so that's not, when we say the critical value is 20 part per million, that doesn't mean we would never see a response to added P if we're above that. It just means the probability of seeing a response is dropping off pretty rapidly. So again, this is that combined Iowa Kansas data set. And in order to do this type of analysis, it takes a lot of data. And we didn't have enough data just in Kansas really to try and look at it in this way. But how you'd interpret this is, so across the bottom here, this is soil test P, Mehlich parts per million. And then here's probability of response. In other words, so as an example, if we're at 20 part per million, follow that up and come across at 20 part per million, that means we only have about a 25% response, a 25% chance of seeing a yield response to added P if we're at a 20 part per million soil test. If we're down around that 10 part per million, we're on a much steeper part of this curve here. We're slightly above 50% chance of seeing a response to added P if we're at a 10 part per million soil test. Of course, this never goes to 100. We're never guaranteed a response to phos, because why? If I've got this field that's 5 or 6 part per million soil test P, why would I not see a response out there? Is phosphorus, when we're doing field trials, is phosphorus or plant or production, is phosphorus always our yield limiting factor? Even at a 5 or 6 part per million soil test, we've got other yield limiting factors out there. So we're never guaranteed. That's why we never get really to 100% here when we think about this function. Where does it bottom out at? Truly, if we'll say, okay, where do I, essentially have almost zero probability of getting a response to applying additional phos? For corn, based on this data set, we really got to get to about that 40 part per million mark is where we would eliminate any chance of seeing a response to additional phosphorus above that. Does this make sense in kind of in terms of how, we might think about that probability? What's this look like? So that's just probability of any response. Well, what about the magnitude of those response? So here's another way of looking at that. So here's soil test P along the bottom. And this is the average yield response. So this is the response to applying 60 pounds of phos, okay? And here they got it grouped into low, high, and medium yields. We'll split that out here in a minute. But in general, what you can see, certainly you see as we get the lower soil test P levels, the magnitude of these responses in terms of bushels per acre start to grow in magnitude, as you would expect. When we talk about that scenario, even at 20 part per million, we've got two things working here. We think about 20 part per million as a critical value. Not only are we only talking about a 25% chance of seeing a response, but the magnitudes of those responses when they happen tend to be much smaller, right? And so that's where the economics start to catch up with us in terms of, so if you think about both the probability of the response and the magnitude of it, you kind of put that together into what's your probability of getting a return on your investment. That's where the 20 part per million kind of comes together as that pinch point. So here, if you break it up by yield goals, here's kind of this low yield, more of a dry land type scenario. The biggest yield responses in there are about that 75 bushel mark. Most of them are between about 0 and 30 bushel in terms of that positive response to 60 pounds of P at the low end. Here's where we are, even at 20 part per million, we can still see some 20 bushel responses, even though we're at a 20 part per million soil test. But that's not a very likely, that's only occurring about 25% of the time. How's that change if we move into like a high yielding irrigated situation? Well, not surprisingly, the magnitude of those responses become a lot larger, right? Higher yield environment, we're in theory taking care of a lot of other stresses out there, and so we see a much bigger response to the phosphorus piece of that. But actually, it's a little bit cleaner in terms of, once you're above 20, in terms of how that flattens out a little bit. Okay, what's it mean if you actually put the economics to that? So this is trying to, approximately close to current prices. I did a survey here 2 weeks ago and leased out, and here to the west, I surveyed about, I ended up getting them back from about 8 different retailers, and if you took the average of MAP and 1034.0, came in at like 82 cents a pound on P, and we were right about 65 cents a pound on UAN, average across those. And so we're not too far away from that. But if we look at this overall return to fertilizer at these prices, so 4-1 growing season, and so the difference here between these two lines are soil test levels. So here we are in just a low soil test category, 9 to 15, and then this would be a very low soil test category. So essentially single digit soil test values, okay? And so this is true net returns, price of the PE, application, the whole bit in there. Even at current prices, if you've got stuff that's in that very low category, we would still expect to see pretty significant net returns to FOSS. And so when I look at this and I think about, okay, how do we, we're trying to make these budgets work. I think probably where there's the biggest opportunity, and you don't even have to go all the way to grid, zone sampling, anything like that. Even just having good composite samples of your fields and prioritizing, okay, what fields do I got out there that are maybe averaging 25, 30 part per million? Do I have something that's averaging 8? And maybe it's just about redistributing those dollars. If I've got some stuff where I'm pretty confident the whole field's above 20, let's do some intentional mining there and shift those dollars to anything that I have in the single digits, because both my chance of getting a response and the net return of that response is so much bigger in these low soil test fields that even with current prices, that's the best place to put our dollars. So, I mean, certainly I'm a proponent of zones and grids and all the other things we can do, but even at a farm scale level, even just having good field composite information can help us better allocate, where we're spending some of that money.
So we did that, Lucas, this year. I had a producer contact me, and basically, with his line of credit, he was not going to be able to apply FOSS for the wheat on every acre. And he did just like what you said. He's like, well, I'm just not going to. I said, whoa, let's just go do a FOSS soil sample. And we were able to identify those fields that were like that. And if we were higher than the 20 parts, those were the ones that we didn't, and the other ones. So it definitely that soil sample paid for itself on here.
Yeah, I think that's the exact right approach. So interesting to note, so where's our peak in terms of net return? So again, in this low soil test scenario on corn, this actually would, about not quite a $70 an acre net return at a 50-pound rate, whereas down here we're only capturing about an $18 return at a 30-pound rate. So again, it's there's quite a difference here. And then if we would have had, if we've got something here, or really at current prices, if we got something that's close to that 20 part per million, our negative returns on that are going to be pretty much negative, because we don't expect a return to that phosphorus this year. Now, if we do that year over year, certainly there's some long-term consequences because we are mining, but within this year, in terms of trying to maximize net returns, if you're in that 20 part per million range, you're basically going to be negative net returns, within this year. Okay, wheat, of course, phosphorus on wheat, we've pretty much done that already at drilling time, most likely. But, pretty similar things, not quite as large magnitude in terms of dollars, but again, it's that same concept of where do we focus, back to Cody's example of, focusing those dollars at drilling time. Of course, we know there's benefits to putting it in furrow, especially on wheat. I don't need to spend a whole lot of time on that. We got a couple slides in here about source. We don't see differences really between DAP and MES. I got the age-old question again this morning about ortho versus poly P in the liquid blends. The key thing to keep there in mind is that conversion basically occurs within 4 to 14 days anyways, depending upon soil temperature. And so, those high-value starters, they bring some other positive things to the table. They typically are very clean formulations. They're low salt. If you're wanting to go some higher rates, they're pretty safe. Good compatibility with other in-furrow products. But the ortho-poly thing, I think, is a little bit oversold in the marketplace. So, okay, now, so back to this question. We just talked about maximizing net returns this year. What about long-term implications? What about, can I skip a year of FOSS? How's that going to show up in my soil test levels? So, and you guys have heard us talk about this before. I think there's a lot of value in just doing some of the back of the envelope math. how big a crop did I raise, how much did we remove in the grain, what did I put on, kind of a checkbook approach, where am I at in terms of my total phosphorus balance on this field. So just as a refresher, corn about 1/3 of a pound of pea per bushel, sorghum 4/10, wheat 1/2 pound. Here's the big one, soybeans 0.8. And I use this example a lot. I'd probably only been in this job about 5 years or so, and I think it was one of Sanders' growers I remember working with. And I think back, I drove this, not through Kensington, but so I grew up in the McCook-Oberlin area. So as an undergrad driving to K-State, I drove this 924 route all the time. And the transformation in cropping systems in north central Kansas, when I started to go into K-State till now, has just been unbelievable. And what's been the biggest driver there? Soybeans. And back to one of Sanders' clients, this gentleman they'd basically been maintaining their fertility deal as though they were still heavily in a wheat sorghum type system, but they'd started working beans into the rotation, and they had grown a number of 40, 50, even some 60 bushel bean crops in there. Well, you start racking up that type of removal in good soybean crops, he was dropping his soil test P pretty quickly, and because we just hadn't adjusted what we were doing as those cropping systems had adapted over the years. So anyway, something to keep in mind. But anyways, as an example, so as part of doing that checkbook math, kind of a rule of thumb in there is about 18 pounds of phos to change soil test 1 part per million. That's kind of a crude approximation. That tends to hold pretty good if we're around that threshold. If we're around our 20 part per million soil test P level, that tends to be a pretty decent number. Where it starts to change is when we get on the extremes away from that. Okay, so it goes back to the buffering capacity of that soil. That transformation rate can change quite a bit. So if we're, we've had some trials at Tribune, or we've got areas around Leota, long-term beef manure application. It's not uncommon to see soil test P of 400 parts per million. It does not take anywhere near 18 pounds to change when you're that high soil test P level. It doesn't take anywhere near 18 pounds to change at 1 part per million. Now the flip side of that is, how many of you have had some ground testing 6, 7, 8 part per million have tried to build? It takes a lot more than 18 pounds to move that test 1 part per million when you're at those really low soil test levels, just due to the buffering nature of the soil. So it's not a bad number, around 20 part per million, but as we move away from that, really high soil test levels takes less than 18, really low soil test levels, it's going to take more than 18. Okay, so if we had raised a 200 bushel corn crop, we would have removed about 66 pounds of phos in the grain. So 66 divided by 18 gives us 3.5 part per million. Do you think you'll pick that up in 1 year in a soil test?
No.
Probably not. I'll have the slide in here today, but many of you have seen over the years we're talking about sampling for phosphorus, the number of cores to get a good sample to get your error down. And basically we show that even if you pull an infinite number of cores for the sample, our error is still about what? Plus or minus 3.5 part per million, just from sampling variability, from error in the lab, whatever. That's about as good as a soil test can be, is on phosphorus, plus or minus 3.5 part per million. So you're not going to pick it up, in 1 year. Now, 2 years out, you might start getting an indication. Certainly 3 years of this, you're going to be able to detect that. So you always got to be a little bit cautious about looking at year-to-year changes in soil test values, because there's a lot of variability. I mean, you guys see this. There's a lot that can happen, just from sampling variability that really has nothing to do with what's actually going on in the field. But just be aware, we can mine, and it will. It may seem free in the first year or two, but it will catch up eventually. So something to think about in terms of how often we're doing our soil testing and making sure we're staying on track there. This is just an example out of eastern Kansas on this, looking at 5 years of soybean removal, 3 different initial soil test P levels, and then basically you can kind of see how that mining worked out there. And this kind of illustrates back to that buffering deal. It's a lot easier to drop your soil test from 30 to 20 as it is to drop it from 20 to 10, back to that transformation rate That's not, if you're raising the same crop, same removal every year, it's gonna drop from 30 to 20 much faster than from 20 to 10. Yeah, in this example, about a 15 part per million drop in 5 years, so that kind of goes back to that 3 part per million per year. We wouldn't pick that up in an individual year's soil sample, but over 5 years, it becomes pretty apparent. Okay, different methods and just being aware. So this happens to be the critical levels for wheat. We'll talk about wheat actually being a higher critical level than the 20 we've typically assumed for all crops. This is out of 24 sites. Actually, he's got more than that in there now. That's been done across Kansas as part of this effort to freshen our phosphorus recommendations. So this is Mehlich 3 colorimetric. This is what K-State runs. This is what American and McCook runs. It's what Servitec runs. Pretty common test, but that's our critical value of 25. You know, Bray 1, we're kind of moving away from that. You know, certainly maybe not so much around here, but you know, we got a lot of areas in the state with higher soil pHs. Bray 1's not a great test for us, you know, once we're above about 7 or 7.2 pH. But again, those are typically about the same critical value. Here's the Olsen bicarb. That's just a different scale, and so that's why that number's lower, but that's the test we use in high pH soil. Mehlich 3 ICP is another one that's out there. That's why it's, I guess the other point I want to make here is it's really important to make sure that you, if you're using a consultant or if your retailer's doing your samples and the lab you're working with, everyone needs to be on the same page of, okay, what actual method are you guys using to run these, and then what recommendation are you plugging that into? Because there's a lot of options out there, and we don't always, and it's not always as transparent as it should be. There's a lab that is actually in the lab running Mehlich 3, but they're reporting it on the paper as Bray 1. Well, that's what our customers are used to. And it's like, well, that's also a little bit disingenuous too, and adds to confusion in the marketplace. It's not K-State that's doing that. If you send it to K-State, it's Mehlich 3 colorimetric, and we tell you that. So, anyways, key messages: make sure everyone's on the same page. H3A, that's the Haney. If you've got some NRCS money and they're having you run the Haney test, that's what the technical name of that is. And then Resin P, that's more of a research tool. Nobody really runs that commercially, at least not here in the Great Plains.
Europe will run it some.
Yeah, Europe, Australia, and I think maybe in like California, maybe some higher value crops. It's also because it's also a very expensive test. Okay, we've talked sources already. Yeah, really, we don't see differences there. Soil test, here's just an example, another example. We've already kind of hit on this, guys, but you know, what's this response curve look like in a 9 part per million soil test? This would be for corn versus an 18. You know, again, back to this, where's that optimum at? Soil test 9 part per million, we're coming in at about 60 pounds to that 180 on a medium soil test. At 18 part per million, it's only taken us about 25, 27 pounds to be at that same scenario. This is just, again, some of the behind the scenes data on the wheat, showing the different tests and how, you know, when we think about that critical value, what we really are doing is we're fitting different models to the data to say, where's this plateau or where's this inflection point at that gets us to either 90 or 95% of maximum of relative yield. And that's essentially what the math that's being done to say, okay, what is that critical level for this particular test versus, you know, for wheat or for corn.
And so if we go back to when Cody was presenting, you know, this is where it's important, you know, all of the field work that has gone into these calculations has been based on a 6-inch sampling depth. And so this, when we say we're calibrated to a 6-inch soil sample, this is everything behind the scenes that has gone into that work, and why, you know, to get the best recommendation back from K-State for phosphorus, we would say a 6-inch sample.
Yeah. Yeah, what we're hiding here, what you don't see is the thousands of data points that are lying behind the lines. But yeah, that's a really good point, and consistency of sampling. Because if you're sending us back to Peter's talk on stratification, if you're pulling an 8-inch sample and sending it to us and we're interpreting it as though it's a 6, we're gonna over-recommend phosphorus. Because if you think about the stratification deal, if you're pulling an 8 versus a 6, what's really going on there? Well, that extra 2 inches of soil we're picking up, is that a lot higher or lower P concentration? A lot lower. So it's gonna lower that overall soil test value, and so we're going to over-recommend phosphorus back to you. So that's just really important to, consistent depth of sampling, because making sure that the recommendation depth is matching what you're using for sampling. Thanks for bringing that up. Okay, not as quite as important over here as it was at Colby this morning, but just being aware of back to pH is really the big driver in which of these methods we should be picking. This is Olson versus Mehlich 3. And so the Olson does a pretty decent job. High pHs, the Mehlich 3 tends to underestimate. You can see that it's below the 1-to-1 line there. These are points above 7.5 pH. That's about where the Mehlich 3 starts to give up a little bit. If you've got a lot of acres that are above a 7.5 or 7.4, really should be using the Olson bicarb test as your soil test method. Here's Mehlich 3 versus the Haney, Mehlich 3 versus Bray 1. And really the problem with both of those in higher pHs is they just consistently and pretty drastically underestimate soil test P. They're not a strong enough test to overcome the calcium carbonate. It's not a strong enough acid to extract the P, and so we tend to underestimate. So the test is underestimating it, but the plant could still get to it. So we're underestimating what's really available there. So just be aware.
So Lucas, I have a quick question. So if a soil sample comes into you, pH is 7.5, you switch to the Olson then?
Yeah, I mean, if we're going into it knowing that it's, I'm not sure what they do in the lab.
I don't know that one off the top of my head.
Okay.
Some labs, and this is where you gotta be careful, some labs will switch automatically unless you've given them instructions. I had a big problem with this one time. I'd done a whole bunch of grid sampling. I'd taken it to American up in McCook, and their rule is they switch on the fly depending upon the pH. So I had this fieldweed grid sampled, and I got the data back, and about a third of it is in Mehlich and 2/3 of it is in Olson. And so then to try and combine that back together to make a script with, and so anyways, my file up there now has a sticky notes in it, says run them all this way. And so some labs will switch automatically.
The default for K-State is Mehlich 3. We'll run Olson, but I think that has to be noted on the sheet that you want it run as Olson. I don't believe we will switch.
I don't think we'll switch it on the fly.
Well, we won't switch on the fly. I don't know if there's a pH trigger, but if they had the pH beforehand, likely the lab would call, I think, but I'll need to check on that for sure.
Okay.
But best if you want Olson is to note it on the sheet that you want P run as Olson.
I mean, in Mehlich 3, and part of it, I mean, Mehlich 3 works for the vast majority of the samples that come through the lab. It's really only in our real calcareous areas that it becomes an issue.
Or if you're doing some crazy research study where you're looking at P by deep depth, then get into.
Okay, so phosphorus does provide some flexibility. Again, if you got fields that have good soil test P, we've been building over time. Been putting that money in a bank for a rainy day. Well, now's the rainy day. It's time to mine some of that soil test P and free up some dollars in the budget to go other places. Peter's covered manure application. Again, I know people don't like to spend money, and I know it's worth getting the samples pulled. But when we get into these situations where crop prices and fertilizer prices, the more out of whack these things are, the better soil testing pays. The higher the return on investment on soil testing, and that's where we are. We saw this a couple years ago, and we were looking at dollar nitrogen and 80-some cent P, and we're kind of about back. We're basically back there. I know some of this is a hassle. There's people you can hire to do this, and they're set up to do it, and they get it done quickly, and so I still think even after you write that check to hire someone to sample it, you're still going to be dollars ahead. So Anyways, that's all I had on phos. Any other questions, comments, or anything so far on that?
Our, we do a P1 and P2 test through Midwest, and P2 tests, you know, the long-term no-till guys, that level's getting pretty high. You know, we're seeing upwards 80 to 100 parts per million of that P2. How long does it take to break that down to be readily available, like a P1 value?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and we get asked about the P2 a lot. So if you're not familiar, the Bray 2, that was a test developed in Illinois, or Indiana actually, and it's, basically what that test was, it's a stronger acid. What that test was developed for was to evaluate, in that area they had a long history of applying actual rock phosphate. And so basically the P2 test was developed, it's a stronger acid to get at that. There's really no calibration data for the P2 out here. A lot of people like to interpret it as and you could interpret it as, okay, it's a measure of the more locked up P in the soil because it's a stronger acid. So it might have some utilities out. I know some folks really focus on different ratios of Bray 1 to Bray 2. I've not been able to track down kind of what the source of that is. But back to your question, okay, what about this transformation rate? And I think that's where there's probably a lot of great unknown. I mean, that's where we get into, how does the soil biology affect, what's going on, how fast we can transform that into, into an available form. I don't have a lot of good answers for you there. We don't have a lot of good insight into that. The one example I like to use, so we've got one of the longest running irrigated corn fertility trials in the world is at Tribune, and started in 1961. And so we've got some plots there that have had 0 N and 0 P since 1961. We still raise about 70 bushel corn on those. And we track how much phos we're removing in the grain. And so in those plots, 70 bushel corn, we're removing somewhere between 20 and 30 pounds of P a year out of those plots that haven't had P fertilizer in almost 65 years now. And so I think that gives us some insight into kind of what's that low level transformation rate out of that unavailable pool into something that's more available. Now, that's also a study where we're doing a lot of things the soil health people would say that we're doing wrong because it's been conventional till for 65 years, and and so there's a lot of other pieces to that. But no, I mean, that's a good question, because that is, that's how fast is that becoming available? Anything you want to add to this?
What I would add to that, and this is speaking off the cuff, not digging into the literature, but if you're saying you're seeing it in your long-term no-till, the question I would ask is that what's the pH at that depth? And are you actually measuring aluminum, iron, phosphate complexes that if you adjusted pH, limed, would become readily available P?
How about that?
And so, we see this in South Central Kansas, Hutch area, Pretty Prairie area, they've been, that's a lot of continuous wheat with burning, summer anhydrous. I mean, it's not uncommon to find soil pHs below 5. And soil test P levels on a Mehlich 3, 80, 90, 100 parts per million. Simply liming, you may not need to apply phosphorus for 3 to 5 years. It's all banked there in aluminum, iron, phosphate complexes that you simply need to adjust the pH and they start to break down. And so that's where I think in many situations there's a coupling of pH with phosphorus availability in that near surface if we're seeing pH stratification.
I mean, I know you guys are seeing some low pHs. Is that these fields you're thinking of, or that is
No,
it
I mean,
also?
some of these were in the 6 to 7 range. I mean, they're
Okay.
still up there. in
That
range.
blows that theory out.
Right. I mean, yes, we do run into some of them below 5.
Yeah.
I've
at
seen
5
5,
range.
7, 5, 8.
Yeah, I've seen some 4.8s around here. I mean, four to fives, you know, 4.5 5s.
But they're seeing, on a percentage basis, they're seeing the P2 number go up faster than the one, than the P1.
Probably, yeah.
I don't have a good background of the chemistry of those two to know what one might be extracting versus what two's extracting.
Mhm.
So has that been part of a build? I mean, what have they been building their P1?
Well, that's the thing, I mean, why change what's already worked in the past, you know, we were always putting on 30 pounds of phos, or 30 to 40 pounds of phos for the last 10 to 15 years anyway, you know, and whatever nitrogen we need to do in there, so I mean, what I've noticed around here in West, 30 pounds to 40 pounds of phos, we're building those levels up where we needed them to be, and then we're seeing, you know, last couple of years with the prices they are, you know, we've not dropped it down to 20 pounds or whatever we needed to use, but the P2 levels are still high. But, you know, your P1s are gonna be in that 15 to 20 range anyway, where we need to put a little bit on. You know, we may not put on it 40 pounds.
Right.
We put on 20
Which,
or 10, and maybe we can draw some of that off of the P2 level, as what my kind of thinking is. Maybe it'll ask for more from the soil. I don't know if that will or not, or else there's other
yeah,
products out there that say they take it out, you know, like your Fulvix and your Humix and all that kind of stuff.
no, and that's a good question. I mean, think about how you got there. It's like, well, you know, if you're doing a build and you're watching that on the P1 or the Malik 3,
Right.
I would expect P2 would be building at the same time, because
Right.
it goes back to not, you know, of that phos we apply, not all of that stays in the available pool, right? Some of that is getting sorbed to the other
Yeah.
cations and getting locked up. So it wouldn't surprise me if we're doing a build, we'd be seeing the P2 number rise along with the P1 number. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm not a good enough soil chemist. I don't have a good feel for, as we pulled down a Malik 3 or Bray 1, does that change what that transformation rate is of stuff coming back into solution? That's a good question.
Because I know it takes moisture and it takes everything else to break things down, but especially, you know, going out west, you guys are probably seeing that too. I mean,
And I think you're really getting into an area where there's a lot we don't know
we
in
don't
terms of
know.
what are all those. I mean, yeah, the chemistry's been identified, but in terms of how do you improve that, or what can you do to drive that, you know, is a different.
because I know guys that are, you know, haven't put P on in 20 years or more, and their levels are still good. I mean, they're low, but I mean, they're still raising a crop.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not pushing the bushels, but I mean, they're still raising a pretty decent crop around here.
The Tribune plot that's had nothing put on it, has that yield stabilized around 70 then? They're irrigated, so.
Yeah, this would be fully irrigated. Yeah, there's really been no trend in it in the last 30 years. It's basically
Okay,
both the
so-
corn, and we got both corn and
So
sorghum.
the native tied up phosphorus in there is becoming, obviously it's becoming available at that 20 to 30 pound. Now, do you see a difference in the corn that's coming off of it in the amount of P in it? Are you testing the corn? It changes from year to year, or is it still is it comparable to the corn that's getting full fertilization? Or is
Yeah,
it-
so we keep a grain sample at every plot and run a
Yeah.
nutrient analysis on the grain, and so we have lower, you know, we talked about that back in the envelope number of a
Right.
third of a pound
It would
per
be
bushel.
lower on that lower.
We're lower.
It's
Those-
not as
those-
it's not as good as a feed.
Correct. Those P deficient plots have lower P content in the grain as well.
Probably lower protein as well,
Yeah.
lower
yeah.
nitrogen.
Yep, yep. But yeah, I guess that's how I interpret that, is the fact that we're still removing 20, 30 pounds. It's gotta be coming from somewhere, so that has to be kind of that mineralization out of the unavailable.
The native.
And you've got residue return.
Yeah, and yeah, we got that's a good point. We got some cycling in the residue as well.
I mean,
No, yeah, but that removal's gone.
Yeah, the removal's gone.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, so I
and
mean,
then in
sure,
theory,
it's-
we're recycling about the same amount every year. I mean, that, in the early years, there was probably some adjustment there, but so interestingly, so on that deal, so that started in 61, we had basically bottomed out the soil test it was before the 70 soil sampling.
Really?
We had already pulled it down to a 6, 7, 8 part per million, and it's been that way ever since 1970. You won't pull a soil test P level to 0. It's always gonna read some sort of basement number. And so even like today, even after 65 years, well, we're due for a sampling this winter. And I suspect it's gonna come back about a 6 part per million, because that's what it's been doing for 30 years, so.
And that goes back to your soil mineralogy and your primary mineral weathering.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, a few comments on wheat, then I'll get into my next 90 slides, Sandra.
Yeah, you bet.
You know, so we're not too far away from thinking about top dressing wheat, and so again, some of the things we're thinking about on the efficiency side. So that line represents broadcast urea. What if, how do we compare that to some other enhanced efficiency practices? What if we streamed UAN and used an NPT product, an agrotane or some equivalent? Basically how we've been thinking about all these, and we've got these trials going in wheat, sorghum, and corn. But, essentially the question we're getting at is, okay, by going to some enhanced efficiency management, can I raise the same crop on less pounds of N? Is one of the ways of thinking about it. So that line represents response to urea broadcast. This point here is where we're at with streamed UAN and agrotane. So if you look at that spread in there, essentially we're able to raise the same crop, in this case, on about 15-20 pounds less N, is what we was able to capture there from an efficiency standpoint. And then the other piece of that is, wheat, we've got this one other dynamic that we don't always pick up in corn and sorghum, and that is the protein piece of it. So when we're working with wheat response to nitrogen, we always got to look at not only the yield, but what's happening on the protein side of things as well. Because it's not uncommon for us in a nitrogen trial, we don't see a yield response, but we can see differences when we think about yield and protein. So that's basically that same example there. We was able to raise, same yield on 15-20 pounds less, and we picked up about 0.2 of a point of protein. Let's see, I'm gonna skip this slide. Basically, just illustrating here that there's value in fall profile sampling for wheat. If we know what's there, wheat will recover that. We've got a risk system that'll get into that profile nitrate about when we're hitting that rapid uptake needs of the plant. We can raise a pretty darn good wheat crop just on residual nitrate if there's enough of it there. So there's value in capturing that in that profile nitrate test.
Okay, Lucas, I have one question before you go on. Okay, if they didn't take a profile in last fall when they planted their wheat, can they take that now and figure out what to put on for their top dress with their wheat spray? Or
Yeah, if you got a window between now and top dress time, I'd do that.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, that's something you can do.
Okay. Now, what if they went on and put nitrogen on last fall?
Yeah,
Well,
so
not as much.
that's where it gets a little dicey, and this came up in a question this morning is the topic turned to, sampling after you've already ran the drill. Well, depending upon how much you had in the drill there, if you're right behind the drill and there's been no moisture to move anything around and you can make sure you're sampling between the rows, you can probably get a decently reliable sample. But if you put on a pretty decent charge of nitrogen with the drill, depending upon how that's redistributed and where we're at in the conversion of that into nitrate could tweak those numbers a little bit. So.
Okay.
Or if you were doing a split application and
Yes.
you've only put like a third of your N out, I think you'd have more confidence than if you'd thrown a full rate of N out.
Yeah,
At
if
this
you put
point
on
in
a
the
pretty
game-
big charge of N last fall, I'm not sure I'd put a lot of reliability in a soil test right
I
now.
mean, most people would put their pea on in the fall,
Right,
when they're
right.
planting, and not, maybe some nitrogen, but not a lot.
Yeah,
And now is when they.
I mean, you'd pick up a little bit, if you're using MAP or MES or something, you'd pick up a little bit in there, but it's really not gonna be enough to move the needle relative to what's in the profile.
Okay.
So, one thing we've talked about in the past, and again, and this is more big picture, but if you're fortunate enough, if you get protein data back from your elevators, I think a really good tool, kind of big picture farm scale, protein can be a really good indicator of kind of where you're at on your overall nitrogen management. And 11.5% is really a pretty important threshold. And so if you're consistently raising wheat that's over 11.5% protein, that's an indicator that not only do you have enough nitrogen in your system to maximize yield, but you've also got enough to start building protein. If you're consistently under 11.5 protein, that's a pretty good indication that your overall nitrogen program's on the light side. If you're under 11.5, that generally indicates there wasn't enough nitrogen out there to maximize yield, let alone build protein. And so that can be a pretty good tool just to kind of get an overall feel for the strength of your nitrogen program in your wheat. It can be pretty useful for that.
Okay, Lucas, we're gonna be ready to eat in about 5 minutes, so they can
Okay.
grab their plates and then you can go back.
Okay, that'd be good. That'd be a good break point. And so, yeah, so this started with some work in eastern Colorado back in the 80s. What's interesting is, it started back in the 80s, some stuff Jay Goose did in eastern Colorado, but even up to the very recent trials that Romulo's done in Kansas, almost every trial in hard red winter wheat country has really kept pointing back to this 11.5% threshold as being fairly reliable. This gets in, we'll kind of hit on this again, but we think about top dressing and how are we doing that. This is one of the things we think about is, volatilization by and large is our biggest risk loss concern for nitrogen in the western half of the state. Traditionally we've thought about top dressing in the, this time of year as being fairly safe. We're not in an environment really conducive to volatilization. About 10, 15 years ago, Montana State started doing some work in their dryland areas looking at this question and started finding volatilization a lot higher than what people anticipated. Now, their weather's a little bit different than us. They get a lot of foggy days in the winter, or days where you get not quite wet enough to call it snow, but you got moisture in the air. So I think that's part of what's driving. They're seeing some pretty 40% type losses in their environment. So this is some work that Dorvar, Eduardo Santos, some other folks at K-State did. This is wheat top dress in central Kansas over in Saline County. What I want to point out is two very different scenarios here. So low surface residue, high surface residue. This is generally in February, in comparing straight urea versus urea with an agritane type product on it. And so in the low residue situation, really pretty low losses there, single digits and, probably not significantly different from zero. But then in this high residue situation, this gets a little concerning here. This is straight urea, 30 days after application, we're seeing total N losses of about a little over 20%. And so that was pretty eye-opening for a practice we thought was fairly safe, due to that time of year. Being dry, cold, surely will catch some moisture to move it in. The agritane did as we'd expect it to. Basically we generally say about, you're buying about a 14-day insurance policy, basically flatlined out here till about the day 17 sampling, day 17 to day 30. That's when we started to see a little bit of loss start come out of that. But still, total loss was still pretty insignificant. So something to think about. When you're using a product like that, you're essentially kind of buying an insurance policy of, okay, is it going to rain before this product runs out that's protecting me against volatilization? So it's one of those deals, if I'm getting ready to top dress or spring apply on stuff going to row crop or whatever, if you're looking at the forecast and you've got a 90% chance of rain every day for the next 2 weeks, I'm going to value that insurance a little bit differently than if the nearby, the 2-week and the month-long forecast are all calling dry, in terms of what's the potential payback to essentially buying, that insurance policy of that product on there.
So what are we looking at on the high residue versus low residue? What is the difference there? Are we just attributing it to more moisture at the surface, increasing that volatilization?
Yes, Peter had a theory on that this morning.
I think you've got a couple things going on, and this goes back to some work that we had going on in the lab I was with at Arkansas. We were looking at flooded, dry seeded flood rice systems. And so, why I'm setting this up is I think it's some chemistry going on. So when what we did is we collected intact cores and we added ammonium nitrate, urea plus agritane. That ammonium nitrate moves into the soil pretty quickly as you flood that soil. The urea, if you dissolve that prill on the surface, let it sit there a couple days and then flood it, you have already started to break that urea into ammonium. Ammonium is sticky. It will not move into the soil profile as quickly. And so, but if you have agritane there and you dissolve that prill, that agritane is keeping it in a urea form. That urea will move more similar to nitrate and allow you to get that nitrogen moved into the soil profile before it starts to break down into the ammonium. And so I think that here in that high residue, you've got enough moisture to dissolve that urea, but you don't have enough moisture to move it in, and you don't have the protection to keep it in that urea form, so you're breaking it down into ammonium right at that soil surface. That's my speculation on what's going on.
Yeah, and also keep in mind that all of our residue contains the urease enzyme. And so with all that residue out there, we're basically preloading the system with this enzyme that drives the volatilization process as well. Okay, Sandra, that's about done. We've got one last slide on this piece here. A common question we get is about the use of, we didn't talk about sulfur at all. I think sulfur is definitely something we need to be considering as part of our programs, but, and I like, if you need sulfur in the system and you're doing a liquid top dress on weed, I think it's hard to beat ATS, ammonium thiosulfate, as part of that blend on a liquid top dress. One of the questions we get, this has been shown in the research, you know, we get some, ATS has some properties that will inhibit volatilization. And so that's just here looking at cumulative loss. Here's straight UAN blended with ammonium thiosol, and then UAN with an agritane type product. And you can see that, you know, in this particular example, the UAN with ammonium thiosol is getting us about 60% of the benefit is what we would get out of using an agritane type product. Jay Goose at NDSU, they've done a lot of other work looking at this, and their stuff would show maybe it's not quite as good as that good. Maybe about 40% of the value is what you're capturing, but it can be a tool, you know. And so, if the price of an MBPT type product is more than you can swallow, but you're needing to get some sulfur in the system anyways, using some ammonium thiosol can kind of be the best of both worlds there. Get you some sulfur and get you a little bit of volatilization protection. Okay, this is the bonus session. I'm not charging Sandra and Cody for this. But I want to switch gears just a little bit in nitrogen. I'm going to try and keep this short and just hit the high points so we can still get everyone out of here on time. But just a few things on kind of the nitrogen side of things. Some of this, Sandra, I'm trying to remember. I wasn't on fertility schools last year. Did you guys cover the new nitrogen recommendations last year? Did somebody do that? Dorvar did. Okay. So maybe I can assume everybody knows that already. If you're not, just the easiest thing to do is just Google K-State MF 2586. So we're 2 years out now since we overhauled our nitrogen recommendations. And then, like I say, coming soon, we're hoping maybe, didn't we decide hopefully this winter?
Aren't we meeting in March again?
Yeah, but hopefully by this winter have out another revision to this that'll have the updated phosphorus recommendations. You know, prior to this, it had been 20 years or better since this thing had been updated. And I think really kind of our philosophy moving forward is that this be more of a living document with more regular updates as we get more data out of trials. So, yeah, Dorvar would have covered this last year. You know, the key thing is, let me skip ahead. Where do I want to stop at? You know, we're taking a mechanistic approach, and so when you think about our recommendations, what we're trying to target is is for a given yield goal, what's the maximum amount of nitrogen uptake that that plant is gonna need? And so it really has nothing to do with removal in the grain, it's more about meeting the maximum uptake needs of that plant. So we've got yield goal times some factor gets us our total uptake need, and then we just start subtracting off our credits. And that's, in a simple sense, how both the old and the new recommendation worked. It's different than what they do in the Corn Belt. If you pick up any, successful farming or read stuff out of Iowa State or whatever, they take what's called a maximum return to nitrogen approach. And key differences are in that deal, there's nowhere to put in yield goal, there's nowhere to put in profile nitrate, and there's nowhere to put in organic matter for an organic matter credit. And part of that is their yield goal doesn't really vary all that much across the Corn Belt. And so their data actually shows is that optimum nitrogen rate is not dependent upon yield level. But they're not, here in Kansas, we got to go from 60 bushel dryland corn in Hamilton County to, guys up in Scott's area, the Scandi area, they're shooting for 300. And so you got to have a system that, can adapt that. Nobody else sees that type of range and yield goals that we do in say, Kansas and Nebraska and Colorado. So we needed something that actually took that into account. Profile nitrate's a very real thing for us in the Corn Belt. That's, they basically kind of hit the reset button every winter. They don't carry over nitrate in their soils with the amount of precip they get and with tile drainage. If you followed anything on Des Moines water supply for the last 30 years, you know where their nitrate ends up. Unfortunately, down the river. So anyway, that's why we've stayed with a mechanistic type system, as had UNL, Colorado, Oklahoma, Servitec, American Ag Labs. We're all using a mechanistic type approach. Okay, that's our old one for corn, yield goal times 1.6. Here's one of the biggest changes is buried within this is essentially an assumption that we've got about a 55% fertilizer recovery efficiency. That probably wasn't a bad estimate 30, 40 years ago, but we got some people that are doing much better than that today, and it varies a lot by practice. So we wanted to pull out that efficiency term and be able to adjust our recommendation depending upon how that fertilizer is getting applied. So that's a big difference. The other thing we've changed, I'll show it, we're, instead of just one deal for all corn, we've also split up irrigated and dry land. We know irrigated, we're just more efficient. We can get we raise more bushels per pound of nitrogen in an irrigated scenario than we do dry land. Okay, one thing that's always caused a lot of confusion is this yield goal times 1.6. And let's take 1.6. You K-State guys are nuts. I can do it on 0.7 or 0.6 or whatever, pick a number. And this is another thing that's pretty popular in the Corn Belt, where people like to talk about how many pounds applied per bushel that they raised. And again, if you're in a situation where you're ignoring profile nitrate, maybe not a bad metric. But out here, I'd make the argument that if you didn't know how much profile nitrate you started with and how much you ended with, this number is pretty worthless. Because it is not hard to find fields in this state that have enough profile nitrate to raise a corn crop on. And so give me enough time, I can find a field that will make this number look really good. And it has nothing to do with my management, it just has to do with finding a field that has carryover residual. And so I don't know, if you know what you started with and what you ended with in the profile, fine, but without that, I'm not sure it's a very useful number in our environments. Okay, that was just let's see, an old example. Talked about this. This is just some of the data behind the scenes, how these things are derived. So then this is back to this idea of total uptake. Here's the yield. Trying to again get to that estimate of for a particular yield level. What is the total uptake needs of that plant? And again, when we fit the data, we get two very distinct lines for the irrigated versus the dry land. And so we actually had the data to support that now in our recommendations to actually split that apart. So here's, well, that's actually sorghum, but again, this kind of how it's laid out. Expected yield times this factor, the internal efficiency, so that's at 1.2 pounds per bushel, and then divided by, this is where this fertilizer efficiency comes in. So at the very low end of this, if we're doing broadcast fall applied, we're saying we're gonna get a fertilizer recovery efficiency of about 55% on that applied nitrogen. The other extreme to that, we're culturing it all on, or maybe we're in an irrigated scenario and we're strip tilling some and fertigating some, that's gonna push us closer to that 0.7, that 70% recovery efficiency. If we're streaming on UAN ahead of row crop, probably gonna be somewhere around that 60 to 65% recovery efficiency. So this is, I think ideally, and this is where we got a lot of research going on, ideally, this is one of the things we actually hope to make this more complicated. We hope to have a bigger table to where you can say, okay, well, I'm going to stream UAN in May, but I'm going to use an Agritane product. And that's going to have a different efficiency than if I stream UAN in March and don't have an Agritane product. But basically, for your particular management, we'll have an average efficiency that kind of matches what you're doing. So we're hopefully making a recommendation more specific to how you're managing your nitrogen. So we got that efficiency. The other thing, here's our profile nitrate test, and then we've got soil efficiency. So in other words, what percentage of the nitrate that shows up in our soil test do we expect to recover? So if we're on a medium textured soil, western Kansas, we're saying we're going to recover 100% of that. If I'm on something really sandy, or if I'm in eastern Kansas with shallow soil, more rainfall, we're going to say we're only going to recover about 70% of that. So again, trying to come up, instead of trying to cover the whole state with one blanket equation, come up with more options. That way we're giving a better recommendation to each scenario. Okay, now there's the same thing in corn. Here's the difference here, that internal efficiency, 0.88 pounds per bushel for dry land, 0.84 for irrigated. All the rest of this is the same. Okay. Peter talked about the recommendations. If you get one of those brochures he's got, we've got the website on there. We've got the, if you send it to K-State, they'll send you back a sheet with recommendations, but maybe you want to play with the yield goal and make some adjustments, see how that changes things. There's an Excel sheet on that website, on the link on Peter's brochure. You can download that Excel sheet and stick your own numbers in and play with it. We've also worked with a number of the software providers out there that are, if you're writing variable rate scripts, we've worked with them to get the new K-State equations in. If you're using software and they don't have that yet, have them get in touch with Dorvar, with me. We've done a lot of that work with software companies to get it right in their systems. So, okay, that's just some examples out of that sheet, things you can play with to adjust what those numbers look like. How's that look historically versus where we are today? I don't think it was any secret. Our old recommendation at high yield goals, we over-recommended nitrogen. We were the highest recommendation out there. The blue circles are our old K-State rec. The green triangles is American Ag Labs out in Cook. The dashed line is Servitec. So that's kind of that grouping. These two low line, or the orange boxes, this is our new recommendation, how it would set up for this scenario. So this is 2.5% organic matter. We're assuming a 65% fertilizer efficiency, 100% soil efficiency. We got 40 pounds in the profile. These are some older economics, 5 1/4 corn, 60 cent in. Actually, ratio-wise, that's out of line from where we are today. But given these scenarios, this is what the recommendations would have been. These two lines down here, this is UNL, with and without the economic adjustment. UNL's recommendations tend to be very conservative on nitrogen, and that's really driven by the nitrate issues they've got in the Platte Basin. Has really driven them to some very conservative recommendations on corn. So anyways, that's just kind of a comparison of where we're at versus where we used to be. We showed a little bit of this already, just thinking about changes in efficiencies. This is Rossville, this be irrigated. Here's our urea broadcast planting. Here's UAN coulter inject. Basically able to raise the same crop on about 30 pounds less nitrogen by coulter injecting that versus a urea broadcast. And so that's the sort of things we're looking at, and these are the sorts of trials we're doing to basically build out that table of those fertilizer recovery efficiencies that hopefully becomes more complete over time. So we're looking at stream, we're looking at coulter, 2x2, broadcast ESN, broadcast urea with Agritane, streamed UAN, broadcast Super U, all these different enhanced efficiency options to trying to figure out what are those differences in efficiency depending upon what you choose. Okay, economic choices. So where can we make some money in nitrogen management? You know, really, some of the slides I skipped over, but the take-home message is there's still no other crop input that has the return on investment that nitrogen has. And even at today's prices, the economic penalty for being short is still significant. And so where can we help make some better decisions? Well, these are yield goal driven decisions, the importance of using a proper yield goal. You know, we think about, I'm getting close to planting time. Do I have a full profile water or am I bone dry? You know, not so much a deal in this area, but out west we talk a lot about well capacity and being honest about what's your yield goal given the size of well that you got. Being honest about yield goal and making those targets there. Number two, knowing what we have. Back to the value of a profile nitrate test. This is really important if we screwed up number one last year. You know, we fertilized for 150 bushel corn and we picked 30. Okay, are we taking advantage of that residual nitrate that's left left in the ground? And then these other economic, you know, coultering, using agritane type products. What are the other things we can do to adjust efficiency? Okay, value of knowing soil nitrate. So this has to be an irrigated example. So my yield goal is 235, 5 1/4 corn, 97 in. Ratio wise, that's not far off from where we are today. So the economics still, absolute numbers are skewed a bit, but the relative differences still be true. 2.5% organic matter, 65% efficiency on the N that we're applying. So to hit that 235 yield goal, if I've got 75 pounds of residual, my recommendation is 140 pounds. And at that price, it costs me $136 to do it. If I only got 25 pounds of it in the profile, my recommendation is $220. It's going to cost me $213 to do that. If you look at that spread in money for that 50 pounds of profile in, if you divide that money by those pounds, we're saying the profile, the nitrate that's in the ground is worth $1.55 a pound. But otherwise, I'm buying it out of the tank for 97 cents. Why would the nitrate in the ground have a higher value than the stuff I'm buying now out of the tank? Application.
The efficiency.
That's a good point. I actually don't even have that in there yet.
The efficiency.
Efficiency. Okay. Yeah, we're on the right track there because when we apply nitrogen, what can happen to it? We're going to lose some of it, right? And so if you kind of think about that, you kind of got to pay a tax on that nitrogen to get it into the ground, whatever we're going to lose, you know, on that. And so the stuff that's already in the ground, the stuff that's showed up on a profile in test, we've already paid that efficiency tax on it, okay? And so, because again, back to getting that 50 pounds in the ground, it's going to take more than 50 pounds to do that because of what we're going to lose. And so that's why the nitrate that's in the ground already actually has a higher economic value to it, you know, that's higher than the cost of what we're buying. So we want to take advantage of that. Yeah, you bring up a good point. I've not already affected. We also have application costs in there. We've got, you know, we've paid interest on it, you know, if we over applied the year before. But again, we want to make sure we take advantage of that higher valued stuff that's in the ground. This same concept, just a dry land example. This is where the efficiency piece comes into it. This is at some more long-term average prices. So this is talking 380 corn, 35 cent in, 235 yield goal. So this is looking at this is kind of worst case, best case scenario. Okay, so we're looking at broadcast fall applied. So again, that'd be that 55% recovery efficiency versus inject and split applied. So pushing that 70% recovery efficiency. So we're really looking at worst case to best case. But how would that affect our recommendation and our economics here? Well, we're basically talking, if we're in this best case scenario, to hit that 235 yield goal, we only need 195 pounds of N, cost us 68 a quarter. If we're doing this, this broadcast fall applied, it's actually going to take us 250 pounds to get there, cost us 87.50. Difference of not quite 20 bucks an acre. That's using long-term average economics. And so, you know, based on these differences in efficiency, this is where you can start to do some math and say, okay, what do it cost me to buy a coulter rig or change what I'm doing? What do I need logistically to do something different in terms of how I put my nitrogen on, and how many dollars are on the table there potentially to justify that? So that's a long-term average prices. This is, we put in numbers here from a couple years ago, he's pushing $1 a pound on N. 5 1/4 corn, everything else still the same. You know, we've got some scenarios here, we're talking about a difference in $53 an acre in nitrogen costs to reach the same yield goal, just because of the differences in efficiency. So that, you know, that can get into some pretty serious money, you know, just, now granted, this is worst case scenario to best case scenario, but it just shows what's the range, you know, how much money might be on the table there. Product timing and placement, we'll talk about this. I don't know about your guys' area so much here, but you know, I know certainly more in northwest Kansas. In our markets out there, we can have pretty wild swings in terms of dry to UAN in terms of what's the cheapest on a per pound basis. And so our guys that have flexibility to switch and be able to, there's been big money on the table year to year, depending upon, do you have the flexibility to pivot from dry to liquid and back? You know, other parts of the state, there's some pretty consistent, you know, differences, but we in our area, we tend to see a lot of change in terms of which of those is the cheapest route to go.
Lucas, you have about 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, so this is more the same, just differences in efficiency, cost per pound nutrient, always do the math. Yeah, we won't get into the variable rate stuff. Okay, here's just a few tidbits out of some of the research trials I've been doing, picked out some things I thought was kind of interesting. This is some work Peter and I and a larger group had going on. This is dryland sorghum. We had 3 sites in this study: Colby, Boise City, clear out the Oklahoma Panhandle, and then Perryton, Texas. One of the things we looked at in this, we were doing this on producer fields, on quarter sections. We'd carve out 80 acres in the middle that we were doing some pretty intensive sampling and work within. One of the things we did is we were grid sampling these on a 1 acre grid for profile nitrate. One of the questions I wanted to look at was, you know, typically we don't do like grid sampling for profile nitrate, maybe some zone sampling, but oftentimes on profile nitrate, we're doing good just to get a field level, you know, composite. And so the question was, okay, even if that's just my goal, I just want a good field level composite residual in, how many cores do I need to really get at a good estimate? And, you know, we've talked about this a lot with phosphorus over the years. Well, Sandra mentioned it in the sampling deal. You know, we really want to be to that 15 cores to really kind of minimize the error. Is it different for nitrate? So this is looking at just the Colby and the Perryton sites. This is just kind of distribution of nitrate content. These two are really pretty comparable fields. This is in the top 2 inches, or excuse me, top 2 feet. And this is looking at, so what we did, so we had this 80 acres grid sampled on a 1 acre deal. And we basically looked at, okay, what if I pulled just one of those samples and said it represented those 80 acres, and then versus all the way up to using all 80 samples. And the average of those 80 samples is what we consider to be the closest thing to truth that we were going to get. So we did random draws out of that, 10,000 simulation runs. We're basically pulling samples out of the hat. And it's either, you know, we're pulling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up to all 80 samples. And so when we look at that, so this is our confidence interval, our potential error. This is in parts per million. If we're just randomly pulling 1 out of those 80 and saying that represents the 80 acres, that was giving us an error of about plus or minus 36 pounds per acre in terms of the nitrate number. When we got up to, and interestingly, not all that different from what we see in phosphorus, when we got up to that 15 to 20 cores, that's where error started to flatten out a bit. And at that 15 to 20 cores, that's where we were getting down to about an 11 pound, plus or minus 11 pound per acre error in that profile nitrate value. Interestingly, you can't tell the reason this looks like one line is because the Colby and the Perryton data fit on top of each other almost basically perfectly, which I thought was really interesting. But they're very similar, you know, both were averaging, Colby, we averaged 55 pound per acre residual, Perryton 65 pound per acre residual. You know, we showed this distribution, they were fairly similar. But anyways, I think that's just interesting to think about. So the idea of going and pulling 1 core and having that represent 80 acres of profile nitrate, well, there's probably a lot of error around that number. So just something to chew on. The other thing we want to look at is, could we predict profile nitrate off of a 0 to 6 inch sample? And I've got some farmers I work with in Rawlins County. They've been doing this for years and have kind of built their own database on farm. They think they can do a pretty decent job of that. I'm a little more skeptical. But at these two sites, this is what we saw. This is the Colby site. A lot of scatter in that data. R squared only 0.07, so not a real great relationship in terms of predicting profile off the 0 to 6. The Perryton site, however, worked quite a bit better. We were able to do a decent job of predicting, taking that 0 to 6 inch sample and predicting what would have been in the whole 2 foot sample. The other project we've got going on, we've got 6 sites. We're doing some other dryland sorghum work. Peter and I and a bunch of other folks involved. We've been able to get a little bit of funding from your sorghum checkoff dollars. Thank you for that if you're a sorghum grower. The other thing I'll bring up, if you ever notice your fertilizer bills, there's a $1.67 per ton fertilizer, Kansas fertilizer tax. Of that $1.67, somewhere between 3 and 4 cents of that comes to K-State to do fertilizer research with. It's like what, roughly $100,000 a year. It's not a lot of money.
Yeah.
But anyways, of that $1.67, we get between 3 and 4 cents to do fertilizer research with. Ask your state legislator where the rest of it goes. Nobody really seems to know. I think the fertilizer tax, we could be doing a little more work with fertilizer with it. Anyways, some of that money kicked in. This is a large project we got going on. Looking at 6 source application combinations for dry spread urea with agrotane, or streaming UAN with agrotane, culturing UAN. We've also done some spraying of UAN with flat fan nozzles, kind of as a worst case scenario. We're doing this at 3 timings. We're trying to get out there February, March, April, and then June at planting, and looking at what's the efficiency differences between all these treatments. We're also looking at rates from 0 on up to 180. And this is out of a set of related trials, but really the take-home message is in dryland sorghum, these enhanced efficiency practices don't always pay. They don't always give us a benefit. But when they do, what we're typically finding is that we can raise the same sorghum crop on 20 to 30 pounds less nitrogen. Is essentially the take-home message. Why does it not always pay? Well, it seemed like sometimes we put these trials out. Here this last year at Colby, spent all day putting these trials out. I'm laying in bed that night hearing it rain and knowing that we probably wasted the better part of a day, because when you get an inch rain, it really doesn't matter what you did. It's gonna even it all out. And so that's why we don't always get a response to these enhanced efficiency practices. But again, when we do, so here's haze. This is putting urea subsurface before planting versus urea broadcast at planting. Same yield, 25 less pounds of N. Here's Tribune and O2. Streamed UAN with agrotane versus urea broadcast at planting. Same yield on 28 pounds less N. Here's Tribune in 23. Super U, if you're not familiar with that, like an agrotane type product, we're overcoating that prill. In Super U, that inhibitor is actually part of the prilling process. So it's not just an overcoat, it's actually contained within the granule. And so that's a product we're looking at, but again, we got a benefit out of that. We was able to raise the same yield on essentially 30 pounds less nitrogen. So that's kind of that's kind of been the reoccurring theme we've seen in these data sets.
When it doesn't rain.
When it hasn't rained.
Within a day or two of application, or an hour in case of Hutch this year.
Yeah. Okay, I showed this slide already on the volatilization in wheat, so that got us thinking we wanted to look at this in our summer row crop scenario. This is the applicator we haul over the state doing some of this work. We've worked so we can culture it on, or we have it raised up, and we can lock those up so they can't swivel, and we stream it on as well. We also got a spray bar that goes on here with our flat fan nozzles when we're spraying it on. Worked with folks over at Shore Point Ag. We've got by-row flow control on it, because what I want to talk about is our volatilization studies. How we do this is we got to put these plots out that are in a 130-foot diameter circle. And so so we write the script up to do that. So like each one of these circles has either streamed UAN, dry spread urea, with and without agrotane, all those different treatments. So we put those on. We have these canisters. Let me show this first. What you'd see out in these fields is in the center of these 130-foot circular plots, we've got a tower like this with these canisters that can spin like a weather vane. They turn with the wind. Inside this canister is a steel coil. And so when we're prepping these, they get an acid bath on that steel coil inside. And then we cap them off. They come out to the field, we put them in here, we uncap them, and that acid bath that's on that steel coil, as air travels through that, any ammonia that's in that air gets trapped by that acid. So after these are out for a week, we take them down, cap them off, send them back to the lab, and then rinse them out with a known amount of water, and then measure the ammonia content in that water. And by having that at different heights, we also measure in wind speed, weather, everything else. And then we can do some math, which we won't get, you're not interested in the details of that. But basically by having concentration by height, the wind characteristics, we can do math and then estimate how much ammonia left those plots. And that's why they got to be a circular plot. That way, no matter which direction the wind's blowing from, that canister is exposed to the same, the same area that the ammonia is potentially coming up off of. Okay, so here's what we've seen. So again, this is all, here's Gray County this year, that's down by Montezuma. So here's our March 25th application. At the high end, we're seeing volatilization losses between 20 and 25% of the applied nitrogen. And the worst cases, this is the blue line is the broadcast urea, and the red line is streamed UAN. So in that scenario, those two are very comparable in that 20 to 25% loss. Consistently, not surprisingly, our lowest volatilization losses have been out of the coultered UAN, as you'd expect. You're putting it below the surface. We're hopefully doing a good job of getting that tied up. Here's our next run at Gray County. Here's our broadcast urea, actually approaching 30% loss on this May 15th application. We kind of got this middle group with everything else, and then coultered UAN at the bottom. Even on that coultered UAN, we're still showing about an 8% loss. We're not always perfectly sealing that soil behind where it's running. There's still a potential crack, for some ammonia to work its way up out of the soil. Here's our third run. Worst case scenario, again, the broadcast urea at about 15% loss. Streamed UAN running at about 12%. Then here's our coultered and our broadcast treated. Actually, in this one, our broadcast treated urea was on par with our coultered at about a 6% loss. Here's Thomas County this year. This actually had some of our highest recorded losses. So this is in our early treatment. This would be the March. And there's some things going on that we haven't figured out yet. So this is actually treated urea. This is preliminary data, okay? So don't run out of here saying that this is gospel. But we actually seen a scenario here where our treated UAN was approaching a 40% loss. And we don't know how to explain that. That's not how that's supposed to work. And we're seeing that in several instances where our treated UAN is giving us higher losses than what we would expect. And we're actually gonna have a meeting on that on campus here in a couple weeks and brainstorm, try and look at the data and try and better understand what's going on. Next period, we had fairly low losses. Worst case scenario was some of our stream treated UAN at 6%, but really low losses there. And then here is June 12th. This is a fairly short time period before we got a rain. Broadcast urea in that 11 days, we lost about 13% on. Sorry, I had to look at a light to get that one out. To our highest loss there. Reno County, here's an interesting one. This is pretty frustrating. We had a rough day in the field that day getting treatments out. Nothing worked right. We finally got it done. And then it came in and rained 2.5 inches that night. So, well, that basically trashed everything. We debated going down and taking these samplers down the next morning. We thought, well, it's going to be too wet out there. Let's just leave them out there and see what we get. In theory, after a 2.5 inch rain, in theory, we would not expect volatilization. What's interesting here is, here's the broadcast urea. Even after a 2.5 inch rain over that 7-day time period, we picked up about a 9% loss. And that's not what we had expected. You know, basically we figure if you get a 1/2 inch of rain, you know, you've incorporated it. And I think you have, you know, and in this scenario, we did incorporate but I think 9% is much higher than we would have expected to see. Our other time period there, really fairly low losses. This was a low residue condition. Beans was the prior crop, not a lot of residue on the surface. This was a fairly dry time period. You know, so in this scenario, we've only seen single-digit losses in terms of volatilization.
I don't think we had an incorporating rain till, we went a pretty good stretch there before.
Yeah, we did not terminate because of rain. We terminated because it was time to
Apply.
Part of the challenge of these trials is when we're trying to measure these gases, we ask the producer to hold off on putting on any nitrogen on their sorghum because we don't want interference coming from around the area. So this year on this July 24th, we didn't stop that because of rain. That's because the producer, he was needing to get nitrogen on.
It was V5 and there was a forecast of rain, and by golly, I could not keep him from.
Yeah,
it was going out.
time. Yeah, it was time. So anyways, here's the summary. Not surprisingly, cultured UAN tended to be the lowest. Broadcast urea tended to be the highest. This is percent losses at all these sites and timings. But again, we've got some weird things in here we can't quite explain. This treated UAN, not really sure what's going on there. Anyways, that's the last slide I had. That's Peter and I in the middle of moving the circus, getting
From
fuel at
Montezuma.
Spearville.
Yeah, from Montezuma to Hutch.
So, questions, comments, rebuttal, thoughts? The most important thing tonight is to answer any questions you guys got, or any nutrient stuff that we did not. I mean, there's a lot of stuff we did not cover. So if you guys got other burning questions that maybe we didn't touch on.